I never forgot the day my childhood ended. I was 8 years old, wearing a yellow dress with frayed seams clutching the ragged doll I had carried since I was a toddler. It was supposed to be my birthday, a day of balloons, cake, maybe a cheap toy from the corner store. My mother Linda had promised me something special. My father Robert had even smiled, though his smile always felt like a shadow crossing the sun. That morning they told me to put on my nicest clothes because we were going on a little trip. I believed them. I believe because at 8 years old you think promises from your parents mean safety. The car smelled faintly of cigarettes and peppermint gum as we drove past familiar streets into parts of town I had never seen. I remember pressing my forehead to the cold window, tracing shapes in the fog of my breath, imagining the cake waiting at home when we returned. When the car slowed, I sat up eagerly, expecting maybe a restaurant or a park. Instead, I saw a tall brick building with iron gates and a sign that read, St. Mary's Orphanage. The letters looked heavy, carved like they could not be moved. My stomach clenched in confusion. I turned to my mother. She avoided my eyes. My father's jaw was tight, his hands gripping the steering wheel like he was holding on to the last piece of control. "Come on, Emily," he said flatly. "Bring your bag." I looked down and realized my little pink suitcase was already in the back seat, packed without me knowing. My hands shook as I pulled it onto the pavement. The air was cold, biting against my cheeks, but the chill came more from the silence of my parents than the weather. I asked if we were visiting someone, if this was just for the day. My voice was small, hopeful, desperate. My mother whispered, "You'll be fine," and kissed the top of my head quickly, like she was ashamed of the act itself. My father walked me to the door without another word. Inside the lobby, it smelled of bleach and boiled cabbage. A nun with tired eyes greeted us. Papers changed hands. I did not understand the words, but I understood the sound of finality in the shuffle of documents. My father crouched down, his face close to mine, and said only one sentence that carved itself into my memory like a blade. "You'll learn to survive here." Then he stood turned and walked out with my mother following behind him. I ran after them, banging my fists on the glass door as their car pulled away. The sound of the engine faded, but the echo of abandonment grew louder inside me. That was my birthday present, a one-way ticket to being unwanted. I sat on the cold tile floor with my suitcase beside me, staring at the spot where their car had disappeared. My chest burned. My throat ached with screams that came out as broken sobs. Around me, other children peeked from doorways, eyes wide, some curious, some pitying. The nun gently lifted me by the shoulders, but her kindness could not fill the hollow that had just opened inside me. I kept asking when they would return. She did not answer. The truth was too cruel for words. That night, instead of blowing out candles, I lay on a thin mattress in a dormitory that smelled of mildew, clutching my doll so tightly I thought the seams would rip. In the distance, I heard another child crying. I joined them, my tears soaking the pillow, my chest heaving with the realization that birthdays did not guarantee love. That was the night Emily Carter stopped believing parents always protect their children. That was the night I understood that blood ties could cut deeper than any knife. 20 years later, I would discover why they truly left me there, and how the inheritance they tried to steal would become the very weapon I used to bring them down. But on that 8th birthday, all I knew was betrayal, raw and permanent, the kind that hardens a child before she ever gets the chance to be soft. The years that followed my abandonment at St. Mary's Orphanage were a slow education in cruelty and survival. I was no longer Emily Carter, the daughter. I was just Emily, a number scribbled on a file, another bed in a crowded dormitory where the walls sweated in the summer and froze in the winter. The nuns tried to keep order, but there were too many of us, too many hungry mouths, too many restless fists. My first week, I learned the rules of the place the hard way. At night in the cafeteria, I reached for a second roll of bread. A boy older than me with scars across his knuckles snatched it from my hand and shoved me so hard I fell onto the floor. The room erupted in laughter. My cheeks burned with humiliation. When I stood up, something inside me refused to stay silent. I grabbed a broom leaning against the wall and swung it with all the anger my 8-year-old body could muster. The bristles cracked against his arm, surprising him enough that he dropped the bread. The laughter stopped. For a moment, I thought he would retaliate, but instead he smirked, muttered respect under his breath. and walked away. That was the first lesson no one was going to protect me. I had to fight for every crumb, every inch of space, every shred of dignity. Days blurred into routines of chores and prayers, scrubbing floors until my knees ached, folding laundry that was never mine, lining up for meals that never filled us. Nights were worse. The dormitory echoed with snores, coughs, whispers of children who dreamed of parents returning for them. I stopped dreaming that dream quickly. Hope was a poison I could not afford. Yet not every adult there was indifferent. Sister Agnes noticed me early. She was small and stooped, with hair the color of snow and hands spotted from age, but her eyes carried a gentleness that softened the stone in my chest. She found me one afternoon in the library, my hands tracing the spines of books I could barely read. She asked my name. When I told her, she smiled like it meant something. She began teaching me words, slipping me old novels, showing me how to write down my thoughts in a battered notebook. That notebook became my lifeline. While the other children fought over toys or stared blankly at the walls, I poured my anger and loneliness into scribbled pages. Sister Agnes would nod and tell me, "Words are weapons, Emily, sharper than anything else you can hold." Still, the orphanage was no sanctuary. I bore bruises from fights with older kids who resented my defiance. Once a girl twice my size cornered me in the yard, shoving my face into the dirt until I bit her wrist to escape. I earned a week of punishments for that, scrubbing toilets until my hands cracked. But I also earned a reputation. Emily Carter does not break. That reputation kept me alive. Holidays were the cruelest. Christmases came with donated toys that never lasted Easter, with tasteless candy birthdays, with a bland sheet cake shared among too many children. Each candle I blew out felt like a reminder of the one birthday that had destroyed me. When I turned 12, I stopped acknowledging birthdays at all. Around that age, foster families began cycling through. They came with rehearsed smiles, inspecting us like merchandise. I was placed with a couple, once the Millers, who promised kindness but delivered chores and cold dinners. The husband barked orders, the wife criticized everything from my hair to my posture. One night when I spilled milk, he struck me across the face. I ran away before sunrise, feet blistering as I made my way back to St. Mary's. Better the devil I knew than the cage of false promises. By 16, I had outgrown illusions of rescue. I focused on school, clinging to any scrap of knowledge that might be my ticket out. Sister Agnes fought for me to receive a scholarship. Her wrinkled hands signing forms, her tired eyes shining with pride when I was accepted into a local high school program. For the first time, I walked into classrooms wearing a uniform that matched others, though inside I carried scars invisible to them. Some nights I would lie awake, staring at the cracked ceiling, wondering about Robert and Linda Carter. Did they ever think of me? Did they sleep peacefully in a comfortable house while I fought for scraps? Rage simmered, but I buried it deep. I told myself the past was dead weight, yet it was the very weight that kept me grounded, reminding me never to trust easily, never to forget the lesson of my 8th birthday. By 18, I aged out of the system. No balloons, no congratulations, just a form handed to me a goodbye, and the knowledge that the world beyond the orphanage doors was waiting to test me even harder. I left with a duffel bag, a thin folder of documents, and the notebook Sister Agnes pressed into my hand. In her shaky handwriting, she had written on the first page, "Emily, your story is not finished. Keep writing." I walked away from St. Mary's with that sentence echoing in my mind, determined to carve a life out of the ruins they had left me in. I did not know that buried within those ruins was a secret inheritance, a fortune tied to bloodlines and betrayals I had yet to uncover. Adulthood did not arrive with celebration, but with a cold slap of reality. At 18, I stepped out of St. Mary's with a duffel bag and the shallow confidence of someone who had survived, but never really lived. The city loomed ahead of me, a mixture of promise and threat. I rented a small room above a laundromat, the kind that smelled of detergent and mold, where the walls were thin, and the radiator hissed like it was angry to keep me warm. To pay the rent, I worked at the local library shelving books. It was ironic that the quiet rows of novels felt safer than any home I had ever known. Surrounded by words, I could almost forget the years of fists and whispers at the orphanage. Almost. But reality did not allow me to stay hidden in pages. Every paycheck was too small, every bill too large. I ate noodles from a paper cup, saved coins in a jar, and reminded myself that survival was still victory. Yet the past followed me. When other young women at work chatted about their parents visiting or sending care packages, I smiled tightly and said nothing. At night, I lay awake wondering where Robert and Linda were, what lives they lived while their daughter learned to live without them. News traveled in pieces. A former nun wrote me once telling me she had seen my parents in the newspaper. They were smiling, dressed in expensive clothes, standing outside a real estate office they apparently owned. The caption called them community leaders. My hands trembled as I held that clipping. They had abandoned me into hunger and bruises so they could build an empire. The betrayal dug deeper. At 20, I attempted college through night classes, clutching at the dream of becoming a teacher. But tuition bled me dry. I worked double shifts, mornings at the library, evenings at a diner where greasy smells clung to my hair, and my feet ached from endless hours on the tile floor. Once a customer cornered me in the back hallway, his breath sour with alcohol, his hand gripping my arm. I fought him off with the same fury I had once used with a broomstick. He called me names, the manager blamed me for the scene, and I lost that job. Each setback hardened me further. The years blurred into a grind of work and exhaustion, hope flickering, but never extinguished. On Sundays, I sometimes visited Sister Agnes at the orphanage. She would sit with me in the chapel. Her hands folded, her voice soft, as she reminded me that anger could fuel me, but it could not be the only fire in my life. She begged me to keep writing, to keep my spirit alive. I did scribbling in notebooks late at night, bleeding my frustration and dreams onto paper. But darkness lingered. One foster family that briefly took me in during my teens had left scars I could not shake. The husband's slap still echoed in my ears, the wife's sneer that I was broken goods haunted me. I promised myself no one would ever own me again. No one would ever have the chance to cage me. By 25, I had scraped together enough to rent a small apartment downtown. It was hardly more than a box with peeling wallpaper and a single window facing a brick wall, but it was mine. Independence was a kind of triumph, even if loneliness curled in the corners of the room. I watched other women my age marry, start families, post smiling photos. I told myself those lives were illusions, the same kind of illusion my parents had worn when they abandoned me. Still deep down, I wondered what love without betrayal might feel like. I kept my circle small. Trust was not something I handed out freely. Coworkers called me distant, but they did not know the nights I had spent curled on a thin mattress, promising myself never again. At 26, I faced another trial. My landlord, a man with greasy hair and too many gold rings, began showing up unannounced. His comments grew bolder. His hands lingered too long when I passed rent. One evening, he pushed into my apartment, locking the door behind him. My heart pounded with the familiar terror of being cornered. But I was not the helpless child anymore. I grabbed the heavy lamp from the bedside table and swung it into his shoulder. He cursed, staggered back, and I shoved him out with every ounce of strength. He screamed threats as he left, promising to evict me. I called his bluff, recording his behavior, threatening legal action. He backed down. That night, I sat shaking, realizing how close violence always lingered in the edges of my life. Every battle left me stronger, but more scarred. The pattern was clear: to survive, I had to fight to fight. I had to harden, and to harden meant risking the loss of every softness I once had. And still, through it all, one question pulsed like a drumbeat. Why did they abandon me? Robert and Linda Carter, my blood, my ghosts, my executioners. I did not know then that the answer lay buried in legal documents and bank accounts, that the betrayal was not just emotional, but financial, that my life had been sold for the price of inheritance. All I knew at 27 was that I was tired, resilient, and still standing. That had to be enough. But life was not done with me yet. The storm that had begun on my 8th birthday was about to return fiercer. And this time, I would not be the child left crying on a cold floor. This time, I would be the one holding the weapon of truth. It was the kind of phone call that freezes the blood before you even pick up. I was 28 when the orphanage reached me with the news that Sister Agnes had passed away. My chest hollowed at the thought of her absence. She had been the one steady thread in my otherwise unraveling life, and now even that thread was gone. I traveled back to St. Mary's, the building smaller than I remembered, the halls quieter, but still echoing with the ghosts of children's cries. The chapel smelled of old wood polish and lilies placed for the funeral. I sat in the back row watching. As people murmured prayers, my hands clenched so tightly my nails carved crescents into my palms. When the ceremony ended, a lawyer approached me, a thin man with sharp glasses, who introduced himself as Daniel Miller. He said Sister Agnes had left behind something specifically for me. My name, Emily Carter, written in her fragile script, sealed on an envelope. My throat closed as I tore it open. Inside was a letter that shook the foundation of everything I believed about my past. Dearest Emily, it read, "If you are holding this, I am gone. But I could not leave this world without telling you what I know. Your grandmother, Margaret Wallace, loved you. She tried to protect you. She left a trust in your name, but your parents hid it. They placed you here so they could control it. I discovered the truth too late to stop them, but I could hide one part. Enclosed, you will find the key. When you turn 28, the account is yours. Do not let them steal from you again." Sister Agnes had enclosed a safety deposit box key taped to the letter. My vision blurred as I stared at it, my hands trembling with both grief and rage. I confronted Daniel, demanding answers. He nodded gravely and told me he had been entrusted by Agnes to help me access the deposit box. The next morning, we went to the downtown bank. The clerk opened the vault, the heavy door groaning like it guarded secrets that should never see daylight. Inside the small metal drawer was a folder brittle with age and a bankbook with my name printed across the top. The balance was staggering. $5 million. I nearly dropped it. This could not be real. But it was. More than the money, there were documents, copies of a will written by my grandmother, Margaret Wallace. She had left property stocks and cash specifically to her granddaughter Emily Carter, contingent upon reaching adulthood. The date was clear, the signatures genuine. My grandmother had wanted me to inherit everything, yet I had never known she existed. My parents had erased her from my life as cleanly as they had erased me. Rage burned through me, white hot, searing away the years of numbness. Daniel laid out the reality. Robert and Linda had lied. They had declared me abandoned. They had siphoned portions of my grandmother's estate into their own ventures, disguising it as theirs. But they had not been able to reach this account sealed by legal safeguards Margaret had placed. They had put me into the orphanage, not because they were poor or incapable, but because I was the obstacle to their greed. They wanted the inheritance and I was in the way. The betrayal cut twice as deep. Not only had they abandoned me, they had profited from the abandonment. My blood boiled as I read through the documents, each page, a nail in the coffin of the illusion that parents love unconditionally. My grandmother had tried to fight for me, but they had hidden me away, silenced her attempts, and built their empire, while I scrubbed orphanage floors and ate stale bread. The cruelty was precise, deliberate, unforgivable. Daniel looked at me with a kind of pity, but also with something sharper. You realize, he said, this is not just family drama. This is fraud. This is criminal. He explained that if we pursued it, Robert and Linda could face charges, but it would be a battle. They had resources, influence, years of lies backing them. I sat in that sterile bank office holding the proof of my stolen childhood in my hands and made a vow. I would not be the silent child anymore. I would not allow them to erase me twice. They had given me away like trash on my 8th birthday. Now fate had handed me the blade to cut through their lies. The inheritance was not just money. It was justice waiting to be unleashed. I thanked Daniel and told him I wanted every legal path explored, every stone turned, every hidden crime dragged into the light. As I left the bank that day, the city looked different. The streets were the same, but I walked them taller. For the first time in my life, power pulsed in my veins. My parents had cast me aside to steal from me. Now I had the weapon that would destroy them. I only had to decide how sharp I wanted to make the cut. I thought I knew cruelty, but reading those documents revealed that my childhood had been nothing more than collateral damage in Robert and Linda Carter's pursuit of wealth. Daniel and I spent days combing through the files Margaret Wallace had secured. Every page was another dagger. My grandmother's will had been straightforward. She wanted her estate to go directly to me, her only granddaughter. There were handwritten notes, gentle in tone, describing how she had worried about my safety even before her death. She had tried to make provisions, but Robert and Linda had intercepted them. They filed motions claiming estrangement, fabricating stories that Margaret had dementia. They sold off her properties one by one, funneling profits into their real estate ventures. They had declared me legally abandoned, placing me in St. Mary's, so they could certify I had no guardian and therefore no rights. It was meticulous. It was monstrous. The rage that settled in me was colder than fire. It was ice-sharp and unyielding. Daniel pulled more records tracing transactions that revealed the Carter's empire was built on theft. Loans against Margaret's estate shell companies set up under false names forged signatures that mirrored my grandmother's handwriting. The pieces formed a pattern that could not be denied. They had stolen everything that was meant for me and left me to rot in an orphanage. What made it worse was discovering how deliberate it had been. There was a document one I could barely bring myself to touch that detailed their application to terminate their parental rights. The language was sterile, legal, devoid of emotion. But between the lines was the cruelest sentence ever written about me. Emily Carter is not in the best interest of this family. I sat in Daniel's office staring at those words until my eyes blurred. Not in the best interest. As if I had been nothing more than a liability on a ledger. Daniel leaned forward, his voice steady. Emily, this is fraud and abandonment. If we present this to the court, they will not walk away unscathed. But he warned me that Robert and Linda were powerful, now well-connected in Dayton. They had built reputations as benefactors, donating to churches, sponsoring community events. Their names were on plaques. To the public, they were respectable, almost saintly. That made me laugh bitterly. Saints who throw their child into a cage for money. I agreed to move forward. We began gathering every scrap of evidence, notarizing filing, building a case that would strip their lies bare. But in the back of my mind, a question gnawed. Did they know the account still existed? Did they know their daughter, the daughter they erased, was alive and about to rise against them? The answer came sooner than I expected. A week after opening the deposit box, I returned home to find an envelope slid under my apartment door. No return address. Inside was a photo of me as a child at St. Mary sitting on the steps with my doll eyes red from crying. Scrawled across the back in Robert's unmistakable handwriting were 4 words. You should have stayed gone. My stomach dropped. They knew. They had always known, and now they were watching me. Daniel insisted we file a restraining order, but fear only hardened my resolve. They could threaten me, but I had the one thing they could never erase now: proof. Proof of their crimes, proof of their betrayal, proof that their empire was built on my suffering. I decided then that I would not only fight for my inheritance, I would expose them, not quietly, not in whispers, but in the full light of the law. Robert and Linda Carter were about to learn what it felt like to be powerless. The knock on my door came on a Sunday evening, sharp and insistent, echoing through the thin walls of my apartment. I froze, my heart hammering, because I already knew who it was. When I opened the door, Robert and Linda Carter stood there, dressed in expensive coats, their faces arranged into masks of parental concern that fooled no one. My mother's eyes darted nervously while my father's gaze was steady. Hard, the same look he gave me before abandoning me at St. Mary's 20 years ago. Emily, Linda said softly, her voice cracking like she was on the verge of tears. We've missed you. I almost laughed. Missed me. The image of my 8th birthday came back in a rush. The iron gates, the sound of their car fading into the distance. Missed me was a lie heavy enough to crush the air in the room. I kept the chain on the door. What do you want? I asked flatly. Robert stepped forward, his shoulders squared. We heard about the trust. We know you've come into something that belongs to this family. His voice was calm, but every syllable carried a threat. I gripped the doorframe to steady myself. Belongs to this family, I repeated, tasting the poison of his words. You mean belongs to me? He smiled without warmth. You're still young, Emily. You don't understand how to handle money of that size. We can help you manage it, share it, make sure it's used properly. The audacity made my blood boil. They had left me starving, bruised, forgotten, while they built their empire with stolen money, and now they stood at my door asking for a share. I slammed the door against the chain, but Robert's hand shot out, stopping it with startling strength. His eyes narrowed, his voice dropping low. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be." Linda reached out then, her fingers brushing the edge of the door, her voice pleading. "Emily, we're still your parents. We did what we had to. You'll understand one day." Her words snapped something inside me. "Understand," I hissed. "I understood perfectly when you left me at an orphanage to rot so you could steal what was mine. You're not my parents. You're criminals." Robert's face hardened, his mask slipping. He leaned close enough that I could smell the expensive cologne covering his sweat. "Watch your mouth," he growled. "People might think you're ungrateful." My laugh was sharp bitter. "Let them think it. I know the truth, and soon so will everyone else." I slammed the door, engaging every lock I had. My chest heaved, my hands shaking, but I refused to crumble. Minutes later, my phone buzzed. It was Daniel. He had been waiting nearby in case they showed up. I told him everything, my voice trembling with both rage and adrenaline. He reminded me to breathe, then said the words that steadied me. "Now we know they're scared." That night I barely slept. I paced the small apartment, the shadows on the walls looking like the ghosts of my childhood. Their threats, their lies, their arrogance. It was all proof of what Daniel had said. They were scared. Scared that the daughter they had erased had clawed her way back into existence, armed with the very inheritance they tried to bury. I swore to myself then I would not just defend what was mine. I would burn down the empire they had built from my suffering. The morning after my parents appeared at my door, I woke with a heaviness in my chest, but also with fire in my blood. Fear had stalked me for most of my life, but fear alone was no longer enough to cage me. Daniel and I agreed it was time to move beyond defense. We needed to build an arsenal of evidence strong enough to not only protect me, but to destroy the Carters' reputation and freedom. That was when Carla Jones entered my life. She was a private investigator. Daniel trusted a former cop who had left the force after clashing with corrupt superiors. Carla was blunt, fearless, with sharp eyes that missed nothing. When she shook my hand, her grip was firm, her voice steady. "If your parents have skeletons," she said, "I'll dig them out." Within a week, she uncovered a trail of rot. She traced property deeds showing Robert and Linda had transferred estates from Margaret Wallace's name into shell companies, then sold them at inflated prices. She found loan applications signed with Margaret's forged signature years after her death, proof of fraud, that screamed for prosecution. Even more chilling, she uncovered tax records suggesting Robert had laundered money through charities he publicly sponsored. Their so-called philanthropy was nothing but a mask for theft. Every new discovery made my stomach churn with both nausea and vindication. The more I learned, the clearer it became. My abandonment had not been a desperate act by struggling parents. It had been a calculated maneuver by criminals who had chosen greed over blood. One evening, Carla handed me a USB drive. On it was a recording from a former business partner who had grown disillusioned. His voice was grainy, but unmistakable. I remember Robert saying, "If the kid's out of the picture, everything is clean. Nobody will question us." My hands shook as I listened, bile rising in my throat. They had spoken about me not as a daughter, not even as a human being, but as an obstacle to be erased. Carla also unearthed darker stories from those who had worked under the Carters. A housekeeper described nights when Linda threw glasses against the wall in drunken rage, screaming that her daughter had ruined everything. A contractor confessed that Robert had once threatened to ruin him financially unless he falsified construction costs. Piece by piece, the picture became undeniable. The Carters were not respected pillars of Dayton. They were predators in suits feeding off the weak and hiding behind a facade of respectability. Meanwhile, Daniel prepared the legal front. He cataloged every document Carla uncovered, filing affidavits notarizing preparing motions. He explained that cases like this were not won by passion, but by precision. We needed airtight evidence, undeniable timelines, multiple corroborations. I threw myself into the work, combing through every file, every receipt, every shred of memory that could serve as a weapon. At night, exhaustion pressed heavy, but I refused to rest. Too many nights of my childhood had been spent powerless. Now power was within reach and I would not waste it. But gathering evidence was not without risk. One night as I returned from Daniel's office, I noticed a car idling near my building. The same car appeared again 2 days later outside the library. My gut screamed warning. Robert and Linda were watching me, maybe even preparing to silence me. I told Carla, and she simply nodded. Let them watch. The more desperate they get, the more mistakes they'll make. Her words proved true. Weeks later, she intercepted an email chain between Robert and a lawyer, discussing how to declare me mentally unstable, a tactic meant to discredit me in court. The irony burned. They had abandoned me at 8, silenced me for 2 decades, and now they wanted to paint me insane because I dared to fight back. But this time, I had Daniel and Carla. This time, their lies would not stand. Together, we built a timeline: my abandonment at age 8, the fraudulent transfer of properties, the siphoning of funds, the shell companies, the forged loans, the fabricated charitable donations. Every thread led back to the Carters, weaving a tapestry of corruption so thick it could strangle them. The more evidence we collected, the stronger I became. For years, my identity had been orphan, abandoned, unwanted. Now I was investigator, warrior, avenger. The girl left on the steps of St. Mary's was gone. In her place stood a woman armed with truth, ready to drag her betrayers into the light. The final straw came when Carla delivered surveillance footage from a warehouse Robert owned. The video showed him meeting with known loan sharks, exchanging envelopes thick with cash. It was proof of not only fraud, but organized crime connections. When Daniel saw it, he leaned back in his chair, eyes wide. Emily, he said, this is enough to bring the whole house down. Sitting there with the glow of the evidence files on the screen, I felt something I had never felt before. Justice was not just possible, it was inevitable. My parents had stolen my childhood, my safety, my inheritance, but they had left me with something they underestimated: resilience. And that resilience had sharpened into a blade aimed straight at their empire. The courthouse smelled of old wood polish and dust, the kind of smell that carries decades of secrets. On the morning of the hearing, my hands trembled slightly as I buttoned the navy blazer Daniel had insisted I wear. It was not fashion that mattered. He told me it was presence. I had to walk into that room as more than the abandoned daughter. I had to walk in as the rightful heir, the woman with the truth on her side. As I entered, heads turned. Robert and Linda were already seated at the petitioner's table, their expensive lawyers in sleek suits whispering into their ears. My parents looked polished, rehearsed, their faces sculpted into masks of parental sorrow. Linda dabbed her eyes with a tissue. Robert shook hands with supporters in the gallery. It was theater, and they were the actors. I took my seat beside Daniel, my pulse drumming in my ears. But when Robert's eyes met mine for the first time in decades, I did not flinch. He smirked, a slight curl of the lips that said he still believed he controlled the narrative. The judge, a stern woman named Evelyn Harper, called the session to order. The Carters' attorney rose first. He painted a picture of a troubled young woman manipulated by outsiders, a daughter confused and vengeful, trying to ruin her loving parents for money. His voice was smooth, each word carefully designed to sway. He even played clips of Linda's public charity speeches, portraying her as a saintly mother misunderstood. My stomach twisted, but Daniel touched my hand under the table, reminding me to wait. When it was our turn, he stood calmly, his tone steady but piercing. He began with the documents: deeds signed with forged signatures, loans taken in Margaret Wallace's name. After her death, property transfers into shell companies owned by Robert Carter. Each exhibit was projected on the screen for the courtroom to see. Murmurs rippled through the gallery. Then came the recording Carla had uncovered. The audio crackled to life, Robert's voice unmistakable. If the kid's out of the picture, everything is clean. Nobody will question us. Gasps erupted. Linda's face went pale. Robert clenched his fist so hard his knuckles whitened. Daniel continued calling witnesses one by one. The housekeeper testified about Linda's drunken rages. The contractor described Robert's threats. And finally, a former business partner spoke of being coerced into silence. Each testimony was a hammer blow, cracking the carefully polished facade my parents had built. At one point, Linda broke down shouting across the courtroom that I was ungrateful, that everything they had done was for the family. The judge silenced her with a sharp gavel strike, but the damage was done. Her mask had slipped. When it was my turn to speak, I rose slowly, my legs heavy, but my voice clear. I told the court about my 8th birthday, about the orphanage, about the years of hunger and bruises. I described the letter from Sister Agnes, the inheritance my grandmother had meant for me, and the decades of lies that had buried it. I did not cry. I spoke with the steadiness of someone who had lived with scars so long they had become armor. My final words cut through the silence. They abandoned me, not because they could not care for me, but because I stood between them and their greed. Blood ties do not excuse betrayal. The gallery erupted in whispers. Robert glared at me, but for the first time I saw fear flicker in his eyes. The judge leaned back, her expression unreadable, then addressed the room. The evidence presented is overwhelming. Fraud, forgery, abandonment. This court recognizes Emily Carter as the rightful heir to Margaret Wallace's estate. Furthermore, the evidence will be referred to federal authorities for criminal investigation. Robert Carter's jaw dropped. Linda collapsed into her chair, sobbing. Their lawyer tried to object, but the gavel struck again. Objection overruled. It was over. The courtroom buzzed with shock reporters scribbling furiously, onlookers shaking their heads. I sat down slowly, my body trembling with the release of years of rage and grief. Daniel leaned in, whispering, "You did it, Emily. You took back everything." But it was not just about taking back what was mine. It was about exposing them, stripping away the masks they had hidden behind for decades. As we left the courtroom, cameras flashed, microphones thrust toward me. Reporters shouted questions about betrayal, about inheritance, about justice. I kept walking, the autumn air cool against my face, the sun breaking through the clouds, as if the world itself acknowledged the truth. That day, the Carters' empire began to crumble. Their names, once praised in community halls, now whispered with disgust. Their supporters scattered, their friends distanced themselves. For the first time, Robert and Linda Carter faced the weight of the truth they had tried so desperately to bury. And for the first time in my life, I felt not abandoned, not powerless, but whole. The weeks after the hearing unfolded like the slow collapse of a building whose foundation had been eaten away for years. At first, Robert and Linda tried to cling to the image they had spent decades crafting. They issued statements to the press claiming the court had misunderstood, that I had been manipulated by greedy lawyers, that their only mistake was trusting the wrong advisors. But spin could not bury the mountain of evidence. Federal investigators moved in quickly, seizing financial records, subpoenaing associates, freezing accounts. Neighbors who once waved at them now turned their faces away. Their office, once bustling with clients eager to profit from the Carter name, became a ghost town. For me, it was surreal to watch the downfall of people I had once begged for love. I saw their mugshots on the evening news, Robert's face defiant, Linda's streaked with tears. Charges of fraud, forgery, tax evasion, and child abandonment were read aloud for the world to hear. I sat in my small apartment with the volume turned up, listening not with joy, but with a grim sense of justice. They had stolen 20 years of my life. Now time would steal from them. When the trial came, the courtroom was packed with reporters and onlookers hungry for scandal. Testimony from witnesses Carla had tracked down painted Robert as a man who ruled through intimidation, and Linda as a willing accomplice, who enjoyed the luxuries his schemes provided. One after another, their allies abandoned them, cutting deals to save themselves. When the verdict was announced, Robert was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. Linda to 10 years with parole after 6. Their empire crumbled overnight. Properties seized, assets liquidated, their names forever stained. Some said I should feel satisfaction that revenge had been served cold and complete. But as I walked out of the courthouse on sentencing day, I felt something heavier. Victory was not sweet. It was necessary, but it carried the taste of ash. They were still my parents by blood, and watching them led away in handcuffs did not erase the 8-year-old girl crying on the orphanage floor. Yet it mattered. Justice mattered. Accountability mattered. For the first time, the world saw them, as I had always seen them, not as parents, not as leaders, but as predators brought low by their own greed. In the aftermath, letters began arriving. Strangers wrote to tell me my story gave them courage to confront their own family's betrayals. Former residents of St. Mary's reached out, remembering me as the girl who never backed down. Even Sister Agnes's memory seemed to live on stronger than ever, her words echoing each time someone thanked me for speaking out. Blood had betrayed me, but truth had restored me, and truth had destroyed the Carters. When the dust finally settled, I found myself standing in front of Margaret Wallace's grave, the grandmother I had never known, but who had fought for me from beyond the grave. The cemetery was quiet, autumn leaves scattering across the grass, the air crisp with the promise of winter. I placed fresh flowers on the stone and whispered the words I had carried inside me since discovering her will. Thank you for not forgetting me. Tears pricked my eyes, but they were not the tears of the abandoned child. They were the tears of a woman who had finally reclaimed her place in the world. The inheritance that Robert and Linda had tried to erase became the seed of something larger than myself. With Daniel's guidance, I established the Agnes Foundation, named for the woman who had given me hope in my darkest years. The foundation offered scholarships to orphans' legal assistance, to children caught in custody battles, and advocacy for those abandoned by the very people meant to protect them. The first time I stood before a group of young people to announce the program, I saw the reflection of my younger self in their eyes. They listened as I told them that betrayal did not define them, that their stories could be rewritten, that survival was not weakness, but strength. Applause filled the room, and for the first time I felt the weight of my past transform into something luminous. The girl left behind had become a voice for those still trapped, but personal healing was slower, quieter. Nights still came when I woke in a sweat hearing Robert's voice in my memory, seeing Linda's tearless face as she walked away on my 8th birthday. Therapy helped, writing helped, but the scars remained. What changed was how I carried them. They were no longer chains. They were reminders that I had endured and emerged unbroken. Life grew fuller. Carla remained a fierce ally. Daniel became more than a lawyer, his steady presence turning into companionship that felt dangerously close to love. I was hesitant, scarred by too many years of abandonment, but slowly I learned to let someone in without fear of losing myself. One evening we sat on my porch, the stars spread across the Tennessee sky, and he asked me if I believed in family. I thought for a long moment before answering. Family is not who leaves you. It is who stands beside you when everyone else turns away. His smile was quiet but certain, and for the first time in years I let my guard drop. Meanwhile, the Carters faded into the background of history, their names synonymous with scandal. Robert's prison sentence was harsh, Linda's parole hearing years away. They wrote letters to me at first full of pleas and justifications, but I returned them unopened. I had no desire to carry their words anymore. They had spoken enough lies for a lifetime. Instead, I focused on building a legacy that honored truth. The Agnes Foundation grew rapidly, partnering with shelters and law firms across the state. I poured resources into education, believing knowledge was the sharpest blade against abandonment. At our first annual gala, a former orphan approached me, her hands shaking as she told me that my story had saved her life. She had been on the edge of giving up until she heard that someone else had survived and thrived. I hugged her tightly, realizing in that moment that my suffering had not been wasted. It had become fuel for others. On the 20th anniversary of my release from St. Mary's, I returned to the orphanage. The building had been renovated, the dormitories brighter, the library larger. In the chapel, I sat alone, listening to the faint hum of children laughing outside. I closed my eyes and imagined Sister Agnes beside me, whispering that words are weapons. She had been right. Words had torn down the empire of my betrayers. Words had built the foundation of my rebirth. Standing there, I finally forgave the girl I once was for feeling unloved. She had done nothing wrong. She had simply been caught in the crossfire of greed. As I left, the children waved from the yard, their faces full of curiosity and hope. I waved back, carrying their laughter with me. That night, I wrote in my journal the same battered notebook Agnes had given me, now worn with decades of scribbles. Dear Emily, I wrote to myself, you were never disposable. You were never weak. You were never forgotten. You were forged in betrayal, but you emerged as your own justice. I closed the notebook and placed it in a wooden box on my mantel beside a photograph of Margaret Wallace and a rosary from Sister Agnes. My life had not been defined by the Carters' cruelty. It had been defined by my refusal to surrender. As the fire crackled in the hearth and the night deepened, I realized I had finally reached the ending I had once thought impossible. Freedom. And for the first time in my life, it was not the freedom of running from the past, but the freedom of standing firmly in the present, unafraid of the future.